Before everything unraveled, I believed our marriage was built on something unbreakable. In the beginning, I was the sort of woman who thought love was enough to conquer any hardship. I wanted to believe that as long as I was patient and loyal, the rest would somehow fall into place.
If you've ever trusted someone who later betrayed you, share your story in the comments. Your experience matters more than you know. He was charming back then, charming in a way that made everyone else think I had found the perfect man. When we were young, he would hold my hand in public, proudly introducing me as the woman he'd waited his whole life to meet. He said all the right words, the ones that made me feel chosen, special, secure. I remember the first time he told me he loved me. We were standing under the flickering neon sign of the little diner where we used to meet after our shifts. He slipped his hand into mine and said, "You're the only person who makes me feel like I matter." I carried that sentence in my heart like a precious secret, never imagining it would one day feel like a trap. In those early years, I convinced myself that every relationship had struggles. When he criticized the way I spent money or the way I talked too much at dinner parties, I told myself he was only trying to help me be better. When he withdrew into silence after arguments, I thought it was because he felt things too deeply to speak. Over time, the man I had married began to fade into someone I didn't recognize. The hand that once held mine so tenderly now gripped it a little too tightly. The voice that once soothed me became the one that kept me up at night, replaying every sharp word until I couldn't remember who I had been before I became his wife. He had a gift for making me question my own reality. When I felt hurt by something he said, he would smile and say I was too sensitive, that I was imagining slights where none existed. He would laugh and tell me I needed to toughen up, that I should be grateful for his honesty. And I believed him. I believed him because it was easier than admitting the truth that the man who had promised to love me was quietly dismantling the parts of me that had once felt strong. I stopped speaking up when something bothered me because I knew it would end in the same way. His irritation, my tears, and finally, his cold silence that could stretch for days. When my friends would ask if I was happy, I would smile too quickly, hoping they wouldn't notice the way my hands trembled. I learned to fill the spaces in conversation with stories about our vacations or the nice things he bought me, anything to distract from the hollow ache I carried everywhere. The truth was, I was lonely in a house full of shared memories. I can still picture the kitchen where we used to cook together. Over time, even that became his domain. He would sigh when I forgot which drawer held the good knives, or if I set the table the wrong way. Little things, he'd say, but the little things piled up like stones until I felt I was living in a place where there was no room for me anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake listening to the sound of him breathing beside me and wonder how I had become so small. I'd trace the cracks in the ceiling and try to remember the girl who used to believe she deserved more than this. But morning would come, and with it, the steady drip of his dismissive words, and the courage I'd mustered overnight would dissolve before I even put on my slippers. He never needed to shout to make me feel afraid. It was his certainty that held me in place. The way he would say, "Where would you even go?" As if I had no claim to any life beyond the walls of our home. And I believed him because he said it often enough that it sounded like truth. I told myself I was staying because I loved him, because marriage was meant to be hard work. But if I'm honest, I think I stayed because I was terrified of the unknown, because he had convinced me that without him, I would be nothing. Looking back now, I see how carefully he built that illusion, how he wrapped his control in the language of devotion until I could no longer tell the difference between love and possession. In those years, I would have sworn to anyone that he was a good man, that he cared for me, provided for me, protected me. It would take losing everything I thought I knew to finally understand that protecting me was never his intention. Because love doesn't require you to disappear to keep the peace. It doesn't demand that you abandon your own voice so someone else can feel powerful. But it would take time and heartbreak for me to learn that lesson. It didn't happen all at once. If it had, I might have seen it for what it was, a slow unraveling of everything I believed about love. But subtle cruelty has a way of disguising itself as ordinary. It weaves itself into the routines of a shared life until you can't remember when you started feeling so small. At first, it was the little corrections, the way he would smile across a dinner table full of our friends and gently interrupt me to say, "That's not quite how it happened," before retelling my story as though I'd gotten it all wrong. Everyone would laugh, and I'd pretend to laugh too, ignoring the hot flush of embarrassment that crept up my neck. When we were alone afterward, I'd try to explain how it made me feel, how it chipped away at something tender inside me. But he would shake his head and sigh, as if I were a child who needed comforting after a bad dream. "You're too sensitive," he'd say, reaching for his glass. "I was only teasing. Why do you always have to make things so serious?" That was the refrain of our marriage. I was always making things too serious. I was always imagining insults that weren't there. I was always failing to understand his intentions. I remember the first time he made me feel ashamed of wanting more. We were sitting on the porch and I mentioned that I'd been thinking of going back to school. I wanted something that was mine, something that made me feel capable again. He didn't raise his voice or call me names. He simply looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup and said, "You already struggle to keep this house together. You really think you're up for more?" The words were soft, almost kind, but they sank into my skin like a bruise. After that, I stopped talking about my dreams.
If I tried to bring up something important, a bill that didn't add up, an odd transaction in our accounts, he'd smile, that same patient smile he reserved for children and fools, and say, "You wouldn't understand the finances. Leave it to me." So I did, because it was easier than arguing, because every time I tried, I ended up questioning my own judgment. He had a way of turning any disagreement into a referendum on my sanity. If I was upset, I was being dramatic. If I cried, it was proof I was unstable. If I went quiet, he'd say I was sulking, that he couldn't have a mature conversation with me. I remember once, after a particularly cruel exchange, I locked myself in the bathroom just to have a place to feel my anger without interruption. I sat on the cold tile floor and pressed the heels of my hands to my eyes, trying to push back the tears. Even then, some part of me wondered if he was right, if maybe I was the problem. But deep down, in the part of me he hadn't reached yet, I knew something was wrong. I started to notice how different he was when we had company. He would hold my hand, pour my wine, look at me as though I were the best thing that had ever happened to him, and I'd smile back, pretending it was all true, because admitting the truth felt too dangerous. It was easier to pretend, easier to believe that if I just tried harder, if I were quieter, more accommodating, less emotional, he would love me the way he once did. He was never violent. That was the part that confused me most. There were no bruises to point to, no dramatic fights that ended in slammed doors or police reports. He didn't need those things to make me feel trapped. His weapons were smaller and more precise: a raised eyebrow, a dismissive sigh, a carefully chosen phrase that left me questioning whether I was imagining everything. Over time, he convinced me I should be grateful. Grateful he provided for me. Grateful he tolerated my failings. Grateful he didn't leave me for someone younger, someone less complicated. He'd say it with a shrug, as though he was simply stating a fact. "Most men in my position would have moved on by now," he'd remark, and then he'd watch me carefully, gauging my reaction. And so I learned to nod, to swallow the humiliation and pretend it didn't sting. But at night, when the house was dark and he was asleep beside me, I'd feel the hollow ache in my chest and wonder when I had started mistaking endurance for love. The worst part was how ordinary it all seemed from the outside. People looked at our life and saw a respectable marriage, a nice house, vacations, polite smiles at parties. They didn't see the way he chipped away at me in private, the way he kept me off balance until I didn't trust my own perception. It took me years to understand that this was abuse, that control doesn't have to come with bruises to be real. He believed he was too clever to ever be exposed, that I would never find the strength to leave. But the truth was already waking up inside me, gathering weight and shape every time he dismissed me. I didn't know it yet, but the day would come when he would underestimate me for the last time. It's strange how you can live for years in the same dull ache and convince yourself it's just the way things are. How you can normalize the drip of disappointment until you don't even flinch anymore. But every life has a breaking point. Mine came on a Tuesday morning so ordinary that I almost didn't notice it was the day everything would change. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter after breakfast. He was sitting at the table, tapping through emails on his phone, his coffee cooling beside him. The radio played quietly, some old song we used to love back when loving each other was easy. Without looking up, he said, "I've been thinking about getting the house in my name alone, for tax reasons." He said it casually, as if he were discussing which brand of milk to buy. As if I wouldn't notice the way my name was being erased right in front of me. I set the cloth down, my hand suddenly unsteady. "Why would you do that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He sighed, like he was already weary of the conversation. "Because it's simpler. You don't really need to be on the paperwork. It's not like you have an income." The words landed like a slap. My heart thudded hard in my chest, the same sick rhythm it always did when he reminded me of all the ways he thought I was small. "I built this house with you," I said quietly. "I worked just as hard to make this a home." He finally looked up then, his expression so empty of feeling it made my skin crawl. "Don't start," he warned. "You know you wouldn't have any of this without me." In that moment, something inside me turned cold. Not fear, not even sadness, just a clear, steady certainty that this was not love. It had never been the kind of love that let me stand beside him as an equal. He saw my silence as surrender. He smiled, just a little, and returned to his emails as if nothing had happened, as if I would simply absorb the humiliation and move on like I always had. But I couldn't. Not this time. That night, when he was asleep, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles overhead. My mind was a quiet hum, no longer filled with excuses or pleading. I thought about all the years I had given him, every holiday I'd spent playing the perfect wife, every time I'd swallowed my hurt so he wouldn't be inconvenienced by my feelings. I thought about the day we signed the mortgage together, our hands brushing as we passed the pen back and forth. How I had believed it meant we were building something neither of us could ever take away from the other. And I thought about the way he had looked at me that morning, so certain I would never have the courage to say no. I slipped out of bed and walked down the hallway to the little office where I kept the file box. My hands were steady as I pulled out the folders: bank statements, tax returns, old letters I'd never thrown away because they reminded me there was a time he could be tender. I sat at the desk, flipping through page after page, and felt something rising in me that I hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wouldn't have any of this without him. But I had survived before I met him, and I was beginning to understand I could survive after he was gone. The next day, I called my sister. My voice cracked when I told her what he'd said, and for the first time in years, I let someone else see behind the curtain I'd held up for so long. She didn't tell me I was overreacting. She didn't try to talk me out of my anger. She just said, "Honey, this isn't love." And hearing it out loud, hearing someone else say the words I had been too ashamed to admit, broke something open in me. I started to imagine a life without him, a life where I could make my own choices without being told I was ungrateful or incompetent, a life where I could finally breathe without waiting for the next dismissal to crush me back down. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew he would fight me every step of the way. But the fear that had always kept me paralyzed was dissolving into something else. Something that felt suspiciously like freedom. The next week, when he left for an overnight business trip, I gathered every document I thought I might need and tucked them into a folder at the back of my closet. I made an appointment with a lawyer. I began to make lists of what was mine, of what I deserved, of what I would no longer allow. I stopped waiting for him to notice how much he was hurting me. I stopped hoping he would one day become the man he pretended to be. The moment I knew I would leave wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost tender, a single thought that settled in my chest and refused to move. I am worth more than this. I have always believed there is a certain kind of strength in silence. Not the silence that comes from being too afraid to speak, but the silence you choose when you are finally done explaining yourself. After I made up my mind to leave him, I felt something like a hush settle over my life. The constant turmoil in my chest quieted, replaced by a steady, focused determination. I didn't tell him what I was planning. I didn't even hint. If there was one thing I had learned in all the years of loving a man who thought he owned me, it was that he would do anything to keep me exactly where he wanted me. So I played my part a little longer. I still poured his coffee in the morning. I still nodded when he told me what I should be grateful for. But inside, I was already gone. The day I met my lawyer, I sat in the waiting room with my hands folded in my lap, feeling like an imposter. The voice in my head kept whispering that I was overreacting, that people would think I was selfish, that I should try harder to save my marriage. But when she called my name and I followed her into her office, that voice began to fade. She sat across from me, calm and patient, and waited as I tried to find the words to explain why I was there. It felt impossible to condense years of erosion into a neat summary. How could I explain the way he'd made me question my own mind? The way he'd taken my loyalty and twisted it into a leash? But I tried. I told her about the bank accounts I wasn't allowed to access, about the way he'd begun to suggest I didn't deserve a share of the house, about the cruel certainty in his voice when he said, "You won't survive without me." She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took a slow breath and said, "I hear you, and you have options." Just those words, "You have options," felt like a rope thrown into deep water. We spent over an hour reviewing my situation. She explained what documentation I would need, what steps I should take to protect myself. She told me how to begin collecting evidence of our finances and why it was critical that he never suspected what I was doing. "You're going to feel like you're living a double life," she said gently, "but this is how you reclaim your independence." She was right. I started small. A photocopy here, a bank statement there. Every time he left the house, I would open the locked drawer in his office and take what I needed. My hands never shook. It was as though the fear that used to keep me compliant had been replaced with something stronger. One night, while he was in the shower, I logged into the accounts he thought I didn't know about. I took screenshots of balances and transfers, tucked them into an encrypted folder on a flash drive I kept hidden in the bottom of my sewing box. Each document felt like a small victory, a piece of the life I was taking back. I began to pay closer attention to his schedule. When he'd be gone for meetings or golf, I'd use those windows of time to meet with my lawyer, to quietly open a bank account in my name alone, to gather the records he believed I'd never find. I also started setting aside cash, just a little at a time. Enough to cover the first few months when I finally walked out the door, enough so I would never have to ask him for anything again.
In the evenings, he would sit in his chair and watch television while I folded laundry or read a book. Sometimes he'd glance over at me and smile that hollow smile I had come to despise. He had no idea I was slipping away, inch by inch, right in front of him. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I began to imagine what it would feel like to wake up in a place where his voice wasn't the first thing I heard, where I didn't have to brace myself for the next subtle insult or cold dismissal. I started making a list of the things I wanted to do when I was free. Simple things: paint a room any color I pleased, cook a meal without commentary, sit in the quiet without having to account for every minute of my day. Sometimes that vision was the only thing that kept me from giving up. Because even as I prepared, the doubt still crept in. I wondered if I was making a mistake, if I was about to trade one kind of misery for another. But then I would remember the way he had looked at me when he said the house didn't belong to me, as if he'd been waiting for the day he could remind me I was nothing on my own. And I knew there was no mistake in wanting something more than a life lived in someone else's shadow. I knew there was no mistake in wanting to be free. The morning I finally told him, the sky was overcast, a low gray pressing against the windows as if the weather itself understood this was a day of endings. I woke before he did. For a while I sat at the edge of the bed, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing behind me. Once, that sound had comforted me. Once, I believed that sharing a life with someone meant never having to fear their silence. But that morning, all I felt was relief that the waiting was almost over. I dressed carefully, not because I wanted to impress him, those days were long gone, but because I wanted to look like the woman I was choosing to become. I chose a soft blue sweater and my favorite necklace, the one my sister had given me years before, when I was still the kind of woman who needed reminding that I was loved. When I came into the kitchen, he was already sitting at the table reading the paper. He didn't look up when I walked past him to pour coffee. For a moment, I almost let myself slip back into the habit of pretending everything was normal. It would have been so easy. Pour the coffee, ask him about his schedule, nod along while he told me how busy he was, how important. But I didn't. Instead, I set my cup on the table, sat across from him, and folded my hands in my lap. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my voice when I spoke was steady. We need to talk. He turned a page without looking up. I'm running late. Can it wait? No. That one word made him pause. He looked at me over the top of the paper, eyebrows lifting in surprise. It had been a long time since I told him no about anything. I'm filing for divorce, I said. For a moment, there was no sound at all. The paper rustled as he set it down, slowly, precisely. He studied my face like he was trying to decide if I was serious. You're what? I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said. The papers will be filed this week. His eyes narrowed. Don't be ridiculous. I didn't answer. I didn't look away. You're not going to do this, he said, his voice low and measured, the same tone he used when he wanted to make me feel like a foolish child. You don't have the nerve. You don't have the means. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. You wouldn't last a month on your own. You've never had to take care of yourself. I felt my hands tighten in my lap. For years, those words would have dissolved whatever small flicker of courage I had managed to gather. But they didn't have power anymore. I'll be fine, I said simply. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. You're overreacting. You're emotional. You'll calm down in a day or two. I'm not overreacting, I said, and I'm not emotional. I'm done. His smile slipped, a tiny crack in the mask of his certainty. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice tightening. You won't get anything. I've already spoken to my attorney about putting the house in my name. The accounts. I held up my hand, and to my own surprise, he stopped talking. I know about the accounts, I said quietly. I have records of everything. His face went pale. For a heartbeat, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But pity had no place here. Not anymore. You can threaten me, I continued, but it won't change anything. You don't control me anymore. For a long moment, he just stared at me. I wondered what he saw, if he finally understood that the woman sitting across from him was not the same woman he had spent years wearing down. I don't want to fight you, I said, but I'm prepared to if I have to. He pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. He stood, pacing to the window and back again, a hand pressed to his mouth. This is insane, he muttered, after everything I've done for you. Yes, I said, my voice calm. After everything. The words hung between us, heavy with all the things we would never say out loud. Finally, he stopped pacing. His shoulders sagged as he turned to face me. You'll regret this. No, I said, I don't think I will. For a moment, he looked like he might argue again, but something in my expression must have told him it was pointless. He just shook his head, disgusted, and walked out of the kitchen. I sat there alone, listening to the echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway. My heart was still hammering, but underneath the adrenaline, I felt something else, something close to relief. He thought this was the end of my story. He thought this was the moment I would beg him to stay, to reconsider, to forgive me for daring to want my own life. But it wasn't the end. It was the first real beginning I'd had in years. The days after that morning felt surreal. He moved through the house like a stranger, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary, each word sharp enough to cut. I had expected anger, but what surprised me most was the way he shifted so quickly from outrage to cold strategy. He wasn't going to beg me to stay. He wasn't going to try to change my mind with apologies he didn't mean. Instead, he set out to punish me for daring to leave. It started with the bank accounts. The same afternoon I told him I was filing for divorce, he emptied the joint checking account into one I couldn't access. He must have planned it in advance, just in case the day ever came when I grew a spine. When I discovered the balance was zero, my heart thumped so hard I felt dizzy. But then I remembered the cash I'd been quietly saving, the separate account in my own name, the folder of documentation proving where every dollar had gone. He thought I would crumble without access to money, that I would come to him ashamed, asking for help. He didn't understand that by the time I'd said the words "I'm leaving," I had already learned to stop needing anything from him.
My lawyer had prepared me for all of it: the financial games, the threats, the attempts to make me doubt myself. But even knowing it was coming didn't make it any less exhausting. Every day felt like a test of my resolve. He started calling me names he'd never dared to say out loud before: ungrateful, manipulative, pathetic. Once he muttered that I was just another woman trying to take advantage of a man who'd given her everything. It should have hurt. Maybe it did, in some quiet place I didn't have time to acknowledge. But mostly, I felt tired. Tired of the constant pretense, tired of trying to explain to him that love doesn't mean ownership. The first hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday. I remember sitting in the back seat of my sister's car, clutching my folder of evidence like a shield. My stomach was a knot of dread, but beneath it was something steadier: the certainty that I was doing the right thing. In the courtroom, he refused to look at me. He sat beside his lawyer, jaw clenched, flipping through papers without seeing them. I watched the way he kept his shoulders stiff, the way he clenched and unclenched his hand, and I wondered if he was finally realizing he couldn't bully his way out of this. When my lawyer began to speak, laying out the timeline, the records of hidden accounts, the documentation of years of control, he shifted uncomfortably. His lawyer tried to object, but it was clear the evidence was thorough, undeniable. For years, he had counted on my silence. He had believed I was too weak to keep records, too afraid to stand up for myself. He had never imagined that I would sit in front of a judge and calmly list every way he'd tried to erase me. I don't remember everything that was said that day. My mind was too full, too braced for the next blow. But I remember the look on his face when the judge told him, in measured, deliberate words, that I was entitled to half of everything we'd built together. That our marriage, regardless of his opinion, had been a partnership. That I had value. When the hearing adjourned, he finally looked at me. His eyes were flat, cold. He shook his head once, as though he still couldn't believe I had dared to challenge him. For a moment, I felt the old reflex: guilt tightening in my chest, the instinct to apologize for causing a scene. But I didn't look away. I held his gaze until he was the one who looked down. Afterward, I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. Of course, the fight wasn't over. There were months of negotiations ahead, arguments about the house, the retirement accounts, the value of every object we owned. Sometimes, when I was alone in that big, silent house, the doubt would creep back in. I would hear his voice in my head telling me I was ruining everything for no reason, that I was throwing away a life most women would envy. But then I would look at the evidence, the careful record of every time he belittled me, every dollar he tried to hide, every moment he'd made me feel invisible. And I would remember that leaving wasn't selfish. It was survival. He tried to wear me down with delays and threats. He tried to convince everyone, my family, our friends, that I was unstable, that I'd lost my mind. But the people who really knew me saw the truth. They saw the relief in my eyes when I finally spoke the words I'd been swallowing for years. When the final settlement was signed, it was almost anticlimactic. A few sheets of paper slid across a polished table. A check that represented my share of the life he had insisted was only his. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about standing up and saying, I exist. I matter. You don't get to decide who I am. And even as he signed the papers with a hand that trembled just a little, I knew that no matter what he said afterward, he would never again be able to pretend I was nothing without him. The day the divorce was finalized, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. I remember standing outside the courthouse, my folder of documents pressed to my chest, feeling the strange, disorienting calm that follows a long storm. Inside, everything had been businesslike. No fireworks, no raised voices, just the measured routine of a process that had already consumed so much of my energy. I sat at the polished table across from him, our lawyers murmuring in low voices as they flipped through the final agreement. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the tension radiating from his rigid posture. He kept tapping a pen against his knee, a small, restless motion that gave away what he wouldn't say out loud, that he was furious this was really happening. For years, he had told me I'd never leave, that I wasn't strong enough, resourceful enough, smart enough to build a life without him. I don't think he ever truly believed I would follow through. When the judge's assistant entered the room to collect the signed settlement, there was a hush so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. I watched as he finally picked up the pen. His hand hovered over the line where his signature would make it all official. For a heartbeat, he looked up, and our eyes met. In that moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was simply disbelief that I had proven him wrong. But there was no apology there, no recognition of how much he had taken from me long before we ever sat in that courtroom. He signed. Just like that, it was over. The lawyers began collecting their papers. My attorney leaned over to touch my arm gently. You did everything right, she whispered. This was never about winning or losing. It was about standing up for yourself. Her words settled into my chest like an anchor, something solid to hold on to when the adrenaline wore off. He stood abruptly, pushing back his chair with enough force to make it scrape against the floor. Without a word, he gathered his folder and walked out, leaving the door swinging open behind him. I didn't follow. I didn't watch him disappear down the hallway. Instead, I sat there for a moment longer, letting the finality sink in. My marriage was over. The life I had spent so many years building, sacrificing for, defending, it was officially behind me. And in that silence, something unexpected bloomed inside me. Relief. It wasn't joy, exactly. There was no triumph in watching the man I had once loved reduced to a bitter stranger. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I hadn't let his threats keep me small. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady. I wasn't used to carrying the weight of my own freedom. But I also knew, in some deep place, that I would learn. Outside the courthouse, my sister was waiting. She had been there through every step, listening to my late-night phone calls, reminding me that I was allowed to want more than survival. When she saw me, she opened her arms, and for the first time in months, I let myself lean on someone else. You did it, she whispered into my hair. You really did it. I pulled back, wiping my cheeks with the back of my hand. He thought I never would. Her eyes were kind, but steady. That's because he never saw you clearly. On the drive home, I watched the familiar streets pass by, shops where we used to run errands together, the restaurant where we'd celebrated anniversaries that now felt like lifetimes ago. Each landmark was a reminder of all the stories I'd outgrown. I knew that people would talk, That there would be whispers about why I left, speculation about what he must have done. Some would believe I was selfish. Others would insist he was the real victim. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that I had stopped waiting for someone else to validate my worth. I had stopped giving him permission to decide who I was allowed to be. When I pulled into the driveway of the house I was keeping, my house now, I sat in the car for a moment, watching the light slant across the front steps. I thought about how many times I'd stood on that porch, wondering if I'd ever have the courage to walk away. And I thought about the woman I had been when I first moved in, hopeful, eager to please, so certain that love meant staying no matter how much it cost me. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I felt a rush of grief for that version of myself, but also a deep, fierce tenderness. She had done the best she could with what she knew, but I knew better now. I knew that love without respect isn't love at all. And as the door clicked shut behind me, I realized I had finally done the one thing he never believed I could. I chose myself. The days after the divorce felt almost unreal. For so long, I had measured my life in relation to him, his moods, his routines, his approval or disapproval. It was strange to wake up in a quiet house and realize that no one was waiting to question where I'd been or what I'd spent. At first, the silence felt heavy. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with old arguments and memories I wasn't sure what to do with. I'd catch myself listening for the sound of his car in the driveway, the way I always had when I was bracing for the next confrontation. But with each day that passed, the quiet began to change. It started with small things. The first morning, I stood in the kitchen holding a coffee mug, marveling at the fact that I could drink it without someone telling me I'd made it too strong or too weak. I could sit at the table for as long as I wanted, without glancing up to see whether he was watching me with that familiar look of irritation. I cleaned out the closet next, not because I needed the space, but because I needed to reclaim it. I pulled his clothes from the hangers one by one, folding each piece with a strange, detached gratitude. They were part of a life that had taught me how to endure, but I didn't have to keep them anymore. I took my time sorting through everything. His suits, the shirts he wore to parties where he ignored me, the sweaters I had once bought for him, hoping he'd see how much I cared. By the time the closet was empty, the air in the room felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for me to let go. In the evenings, I sat by the window with a book, feeling the unfamiliar luxury of doing nothing I had to justify. The old voices in my head still whispered that I was selfish for wanting peace, but they were getting quieter. Sometimes the loneliness would come, sharp and sudden. I would remember the early days of our marriage when we were still pretending to be happy. The part of me that had loved him, a part I couldn't simply switch off, still ached when I thought of who we used to be. But the loneliness didn't scare me like it used to. It felt honest, at least. Better than the constant low-grade terror of never knowing when the next careless cruelty would come. People started to reach out, some with sympathy, some with curiosity they tried to disguise as concern. I learned to tell the difference. My sister came over one afternoon with a bottle of wine and a stack of magazines. She settled onto the couch and said, "I know you don't want to talk about him, so we won't." We didn't. Instead, we talked about everything else. Books we wanted to read, places we might travel, the things we'd do now that nothing was holding me in place. When she left, I realized it was the first time in years I'd spent an afternoon in my own home without feeling like I was trespassing. Slowly, I began to reclaim the rest of my life. I went to the bank to finalize the accounts in my name. The teller glanced at the paperwork and said, "Congratulations," in a voice that made me feel understood in some small, unexpected way. I took a class at the community center, just a painting workshop on Saturday mornings, but it felt like a declaration, a reminder that there was still time to become someone more than the woman who survived him. I changed the locks, not because I thought he'd come back, but because I needed the symbolic closure of knowing that door was mine alone to open. And on the first night I slept behind those new locks, I lay awake for hours. Not because I was afraid, but because I was finally free to wonder who I might become. I knew there would be people who thought I was cruel for leaving, people who believed a woman should endure anything to keep a marriage intact. But I also knew that those people had never felt the slow suffocation of being erased by someone who claimed to love you. They had never sat across a kitchen table from a man who spoke to you like an inconvenience he regretted acquiring. They had never woken up one day and realized that staying was no longer noble. It was self-betrayal. And so, when the guilt tried to creep back in, I reminded myself, I did not leave because I stopped loving him. I left because I finally loved myself more. The aftermath wasn't easy. Grief doesn't simply vanish because you chose to walk away. But it was the kind of grief that made space for something better, a quieter mind, an unburdened heart, a life that belonged to me alone. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. Because whatever waited for me on the other side of this ending, I knew one thing for certain. I had already survived the hardest part. When people hear my story, they often ask the same question: why did you stay so long? It's a question I used to ask myself in the quiet hours when I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, replaying all the moments when I could have walked away, all the chances I'd had to choose something better. And for a long time, I thought the answer was simple: because I was afraid. Afraid of the unknown, afraid of the judgment, afraid of being alone in a world that doesn't always have much patience for women who stop apologizing for their own survival. But now, standing on the other side of that life, I understand it wasn't only fear that kept me there. It was hope. The hope that if I just held on a little longer, tried a little harder, loved him a little more, something would change. That the man he had been in the beginning, the one who looked at me like I was everything, would come back. It's a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that makes you swallow your voice 1,000 times, the kind that teaches you to measure your worth by someone else's comfort. It took me years to see it for what it was. If you're listening to this and you feel that same dull ache, if you've been carrying that same hope like a secret you're ashamed to name, I want you to know, you are not alone. You are not weak because you tried to love someone who made you small. You are not foolish because you believed their promises longer than you should have. You are simply human. And being human doesn't make you unworthy of respect, or kindness, or the right to a life that feels like your own. I wish someone had told me sooner that it was okay to leave, that it was okay to want peace more than I wanted to keep a promise to someone who had long since stopped keeping theirs to me. I wish someone had looked me in the eye and said, you don't have to earn your right to exist. Because here's the truth. You don't owe anyone the pieces of yourself you have to break off to make them comfortable. You don't owe anyone your silence just because they're afraid of what your honesty might reveal. And you don't have to stay in a place where you are only tolerated when you are quiet. There will be people who don't understand why you left. People who will tell you that marriage is supposed to be hard, that your vows should matter more than your happiness. Let them think what they will. They weren't the ones living in the house where you felt yourself disappearing a little more each year. They weren't the ones who woke up every day wondering if this was all there would ever be. You were. And that means you are the only one who gets to decide when enough is enough. When I finally closed that door behind me, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. I felt relieved. I felt like I was stepping into a life I didn't know how to live yet, a life where I would have to learn how to trust myself again. But I also felt proud. Proud that I had stopped waiting for permission to save myself. Proud that I had finally chosen to believe that my voice mattered, even if it shook when I used it. If you are standing at the edge of your own ending, wondering if you have the strength to leave, I hope you hear me when I say, you do. It won't be easy. You will grieve what you lost, even if what you lost was never really yours. You will question yourself more times than you can count. But you will also discover something you can't even imagine yet. A quiet inside you that feels like freedom. You deserve that freedom. You deserve a life that isn't measured by someone else's temper or approval. You deserve mornings where you wake up and the first thing you feel is peace, not dread. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. You are allowed to choose yourself, even if it means starting over. Even if it means standing alone. Even if it means being misunderstood by everyone who never saw the truth. Because in the end, it's better to be alone in your own integrity than to stay in a place where you have to disappear to be loved. So here is my invitation to you. If you've ever been where I've been, if you've ever loved someone who taught you to doubt your own worth, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And no matter what anyone has told you, so do you.